We want to welcome you very warmly to the launch of Rob Gordon's book, Ethnologists in Camouflage, Introducing Apartheid to Namibia. This is an informal discussion, so there's no protocol to be observed. Just know that every one of you is deeply appreciated for having come, and you are so welcome. This is the first book launch we've had in over a year, so we've been very excited and full of anticipation. We organized it in less than a week, and that was solely due to the generosity of our author. He has footed the bill for the venue and for the drinks and the refreshments. So please give him a big thank you. So now I would like to introduce him briefly, although I suspect he probably knows each one of you personally, because he knows everybody. Rob Gordon is currently the Emeritus Professor at the University of Vermont and a research fellow at the University of the Free State. But much more important than that is that he was born here in Windhoek and raised, even more importantly, in Keetmanshoop. So this, I think, is his really great distinction. His book is about policies and events and processes that occurred during his lifetime and during the lifetime of most of us. So I think this is what gives the book its real thrill of excitement. Rob has just defined what anthropology is for me on Friday when we chatted. He said, you look around society, find something that interests you, and then study it. A conversation with him is pretty much like that. He's interested in everything and everyone. Primarily the San, and he's supported and written about them, but I think that what I'll do is leave him to talk more about himself and the interesting fact that his father was the mayor of Keetmanshoop, and I'll go on to just briefly describe the evolution of this book. In 2018, Rob emailed me with a proposal that we should publish a Namibian or Southern African edition of his book, which had been accepted by Berghahn Books on condition that they were happy for a Southern African edition to be published. Now, Berghahn Books is a big-time publisher. Oxford and New York, they produce 100 titles a year. They publish around 40 journals. But we were so happy that he came to the University of Namibia Press that we said to him, sorry, not with the title you want, which was Making the Difference. Now, we have a book called Making a Difference by Libertine Amadila. So Rob had to change the title. And I'm going to briefly go through the titles, Rob, because I think it's such a lot of fun for a lot of people. He changed to The Grand Delusion, How Anthropologists and Other Experts Shaped Namibia. And that was dropped by Berghahn, and it came out in their edition as South Africa's Dreams, Ethnologists and Apartheid, with a cover that Rob didn't like very much, and one that we didn't like either, most definitely. And here we have to give acknowledgement and thanks to Dag Henriksson of Basler Africa Bibliographien, who gave us permission to use the photograph that Rob originally wanted, which is on the current cover of the book. And I would like to acknowledge my colleague Anapala Bakamwena, who put the cover design together. And we were really pleased with it because we thought it absolutely reflected the contents of the book. So, what I did want to say about Berghaan was, if you had wanted to buy Rob's book from Berghaan, you would have had to pay £89 sterling or 120 US dollars. This translates roughly to 1,800 Namibian. And that's before they send it to you. So you're looking at an investment of over 2,200 Namibian dollars to get a copy of his book. And that's why Rob and a number of other researchers are determined to make their research available at an affordable price. So $200 for Rob's book this evening is an absolute steal. But the mission of the University of Namibia Press is to make good research results accessible and affordable to Namibians in the country where the research took place. But we thank Rob very much for taking this line. Okay, so now I will briefly introduce the other discussants and then hand over. The four of them have got a lot to say. The book has generated huge interest and enthusiasm because, as I said earlier, the events took place within our lifetimes and there was a lot we didn't know. So Rob's research into archives all over the world has really turned up a lot of very interesting new information. So on Rob's right is Dr. Michael Cooper, currently the director of the Labour Resource and Research Institution. He is also a UNAM graduate and then flew on to the University of the Western Cape, where he obtained his postgraduate degrees and lectured for several years before coming back to the director's post. He is from Kavango, northeast Namibia, so he has a vested interest in this book, as does Shampati Shirema, who's from the same area, Kavango in northeastern Namibia. He's also a UNAM graduate and has lots of experience teaching as an administrator, and currently he's a lecturer in the education faculty at UNAM, Commercial campus. And then that brings me to Cletus Lekua, Dr. Cletus Lekua, who is a UNAM graduate, also went on to UWC. He's also from Kavango, northeastern Namibia. And he is the fastest reviewer I've ever met. I asked him if he would review the book, and I got the review well before I thought it possible. And then I must also just refer to Michael Cooper's review. We realized that it could be made into a preface for the book. So we have him to thank for that, and also for a number of edits of the indigenous language terms, which Anapala also helped with. So we've made this book a truly Namibian edition in lots of different ways. So thank you, Rob. I'm going to give over to you to run the rest of the discussion.
Thank you for coming. Please drink and eat. I want to try and claim it on my research budget. So, oops. Anyway, it's great to be back in Namibia. where I'm from, it's snowing right now, so you can see I'm appreciating this. Jill, thank you very much for those brilliant works and doing such a great job on this book. It's vastly superior to the Bergman edition. There's no questions asked. But I do want to, so I'm an anthropologist, and there's this myth that the term anthropology is derived from anthropos and logos, the study of humanity. But if you look in the Greek lexicon, you can translate it as bearer of scandals. So I am proud to be an anthropologist. I think it's a very important role which we have is to look at scandals or potential scandals, and we can talk about that at the end. Let me explain sort of how I got to write this book. After my PhD, I got a job in Papua New Guinea. And being idealistic, I mean, it was an idealistic time. The Prime Minister drove around in a Datsun Bucky, But it's changed a lot now. Papua New Guinea has imported a lot of Maseratis for the ministers. But it was an idealistic time. And so I decided, okay, PhD in hand, I'm going to do research on what the people need. So it was a good excuse to travel around Papua New Guinea. And everyone said violence is the big issue. So I did a study of what's called rural tribal violence, but what we would call wars. And as I was explaining, I've attended over 50 wars, but they were with bows and arrows, but nevertheless wars. And so when I got my job, I started teaching a course called Law, War, and Disorder. I might mention that the way my approach was heavily influenced by the local Quakers in Port Moresby and looking for alternatives to violence. And that came, then I sort of met John Marshall. Oops. They can't hear me? Oh, okay, great. I hate holding those phallic symbols. So I worked with John Marshall on the Bushmen, and then, of course, the logic, there was all these anthropologists studying the Bushmen. I made to look at the role of the Bushmen within the wider society. And I was involved with a human rights organization called Cultural Survival. And then some anthropologists wrote a petition protesting about the militarization of the Bushmen. And I knew nothing about it. So I thought, what the heck, how do you create copy? I mean, there's a journalist here. You write a letter to all the anthropology departments in South Africa, and you say, hey, can you comment on this? And I got this most amazing response from the professor at Potchefstroom, who then forwarded my letter to the chief ethnologist of the SADF. And he wrote about 4 pages, single-spaced, complete quatch. I mean, there's no other word to explain it. So what do you do when you get stuff like that, when you build a file and you start collecting stuff on the military and the role of the military in anthropology? And I might mention that the first professorship in anthropology was created in 1865 in the Dutch Military Academy. There's a very interesting role between anthropology and the military, and we can talk about that. It's not just the SADF, the Germans did it, the British did it, the Americans did it. They really screwed up in Vietnam and in Afghanistan. And that's interesting because if you trace the route of military ethnologists in South Africa, it trace right back to Magnus Milan when he was doing courses, staff courses in America. So I kept that. So that was the first point. That was one of the turning points. Then the second turning point, did I mention, you didn't mention, I went to Stellenbosch University, the Harvard of Afrikaner, which was a real nice place. Plus there was the when I was there. So Jonathan Janssen, the rector at the University of the Free State, invited me to spend time in Bloemfontein. And people joke about Bloemfontein. Papers and all different book papers. And Robert, since I'd heard a lot about him and since he'd worked on Namibia, I started looking through his papers. And what I found was a remarkable story. He'd been a missionary in Malawi, so he was interested in the matrilineal belt, which goes right through to the Kalele. He turned down an MBE because he was, the Boer War was still very much in his mind. He got his PhD from Iceland, got a job at Stellenbosch, was heavily involved in SABRA, which is the South African Bureau of Racial Affairs, which basically tried to provide an intellectual basis for apartheid. But at the same time, he was a member of the Buddha Board, and he was a rapid riser. He was, in next to no time, he was chairman of the discussion group about African affairs, Bantu affairs, as it was called. But being an anthropologist interested in matrilineal societies, he worked in a model. And because he was following that, but at the same time, being a member of the AB, he would get special leave from Stellenbosch University to do research here. But at the same time, he was spying on SWAPO. He was reporting on SWAPO, and his major claim to fame in his memoirs, he says, when Carpio came to this country, none of you remember Carpio, do you? No. He claims to have successfully persuaded Twibo to stop a mass protest march. Anyway, he spends a lot of time traveling around. He's the organizer, the inspiration for the Gwendal Commission, which becomes very important. It's the first and probably the only effort to impose large-scale grand apartheid, buying up homelands and trying to create things. And what intrigued me was, this is such an absurd idea. I mean, even when I was doing fieldwork in Okamba in the 60s, people were laughing. They were saying, how could Damraland or Namaland ever become independent? This is the most absurd idea. So the question then came, I mean, Robert was a highly intelligent person, a very moral person, devout Christian. How do intelligent people make stupid ideas, or get stupid ideas and follow them? And it's a universal problem. It's not restricted to Afrikaners. It's a global problem. How the right people screw up. And so what I did was I started doing an analysis of the Buddha Board and the role of secret societies and how that shackles the imagination and stops you from moving beyond it. So that was the part which I got into. At the same time, I started visiting Namibia, and I met some of these military ethnologists. I went to the Academy for Tertiary Education. They had a racial sensitivity seminar which I managed to attend, and there a military ethnologist gave a lecture. And he was making, the person was making statements like, oh, the reason why Herero love flies is because they know there are lots of flies, there's got to be manure nearby, which means there are lots of cattle nearby. Great logic. Another one of the vignettes which I remembered, which I have in my notebooks, is the reason why Africans push whites out of the way getting into elevators is because in traditional Bantu society, the Impi go in to see if there are assassins lurking there. Mm-hmm. And the scary part was, I looked at the people attending this seminar, and none of them were laughing. They were writing it down seriously. So I thought, this is interesting. And then my theoretical approach sort of emerged from it. There's a great thinker, Erwin knows about, Moritz Julius Bond. Probably none of you have heard of, but you should follow him. He did his doctorate, studied, he wanted to go to the most backward part of Europe to do his doctorate, which happens to be Ireland. So he goes there, he has a great time with William Butler Yeats and all these people, and he writes this wonderful book about the backward areas of Europe. But then he decides he's going to test Hobson's theory of imperialism. Travels around Lesotho, meets Marengo in Polsmoor prison. Then Munich University says, hey, go up to Namibia because they're having some trouble there. So he comes up here, And why? Because he's Jewish, he has a lot of racism from the Prussians. And while he's clicking his heels and Bantu, he has an insight, he has an epiphany. He says, colonialism is not only racist and exploitative, it's also ridiculous. And that's the way I pick up. I think we've got to look at the ridiculousness. And he becomes very interesting. He's the first European scholar to talk about the necessity of decolonization in 1922. And it's fascinating that no one knows about this dude. But that's because he was a wandering scholar. He didn't have any PhD students or acolytes to sort of build on his stuff. So I've started looking at Namibia and colonialism as a form of ridiculous. Where that becomes important is if you read Steinbeck, the thinkers about colonialism, they say the key to understanding colonialism is this thing of native policy, which is what makes it different. So you've got the natives, and if you have natives, you've got to say us and them. So the key, this is sort of some of the thinking, we can discuss that later on. And that's why making the difference with the original title, because what these anthropologists were doing was emphasizing the difference. And in my book, I've decided to emphasize the similarities. So I look at fieldwork as a form of divination, which people use to divine what's happening, because Gravel is obsessed with looking for the undercurrents, which is what diviners do, yeah, if you sing, trying to locate it. So anyway, then I got this big file on, Bloemfontein is near Pretoria, so I went to the SAPF archives and started looking at counterinsurgency operations, and that's, I think, what these folks are going to be talking about. There were some really shady characters posing as anthropologists in this country, which I'm happy to talk about, but I'll let these gentlemen talk first. We can have a discussion on it. If you read the book, that's meant to provoke. And I hope we have a debate, because I think these are serious issues. If you look at it, it also touches on this current trendy thing called fake news, because why people can't see that. How do you counter fake news? How do you counter these crazy theories?
Thanks, Rob, and good evening to you all. Let me also greet my teachers who are here, and also my librarians who are also here from my time when I was at UNA. It's a pleasure to see you again. I think, first of all, I need to thank you, because in the project of this book, we have really connected many dots that did not have any connection. And I'm saying this personally because I was also working on these issues that you have just mentioned. I wrote about nationhood, and having to write about nationhood, there was no way that you could not really engage the archive, the colonial archive of Namibia and so on. That being said, I think it's then also important to speak about the discipline itself, anthropology. And I think I like your take, being the bearer of gossip or scandalous news. That maybe having to bring it to the context of the country where you will realize that there are very few anthropologists. And I think I'll not shy away to mention that I ended up doing anthropology by accident, because I actually didn't really know what anthropology was. And just because I wanted to do postgraduate studies, I saw an advert. There was funding from Basel, Carl Friedman Foundation, and then there I was, and I ended up doing this thing. And it really became very interesting for me, because I started to ask questions as to why in Namibia it is not really that known. And it's really just a step from what Robert said, to say that during the wartime of liberation in Namibia, we found there were a lot of ethnologists, or Volkerkendigers as they were known by the time, and then the stigma then that fell the discipline thereafter. And when I interact with my friends from West Africa, where they actually totally stopped speaking about anthropology, but that they will rather speak about the sociology of the Yoruba or the sociology of the Igbo. So that's how problematic the discipline actually became. To say, were you recording what you are seeing? Were you critically engaging what you are seeing? And which is what he has done, because in this book and the other work of his that I have read, for me as a student of anthropology at the time, it was always enabling me to see perhaps what my supervisor is not quite clearly saying, or what I'm reading in text is not quite really coming out clearly. So this really also open up spaces to look the discipline through the racial lines, or being white doing anthropology, and being black doing anthropology, and having a white supervisor who might probably not understand from the perspective where you are writing from. So I think these are some of the issues that came out from looking at the discipline at the time. So the other thing is to say that maybe I heard the universities also opening up anthropology. I don't know whether it's true, but I heard something like that. I think it needs to be Namibianized if something like that is to happen. To say, what anthropology is it that we want to do? What should be the topics about? And who should perhaps even, should government also have a hand in it in terms of supporting this kind of scholarship? Because you see, and as you are going to read in this nice book, that many of these ethnologists were funded by the government through various agencies. So what came out of that in this project, and what can we do with it if we have to Namibianize our own anthropology? What I like about the book is how Rob struggles over various key topics of the history of the country, from really beginning to engage the interwar irrelevance and vis-a-vis the discipline, and then how he moves to the post-war, post-Second World War, and where the discipline really started also to reform, when you look at some of the texts that came about around that time, and really coming to identify this Bouvet, and with whom, when you look at various other ethnologists who were largely also Afrikaner, where their writing were not quite different from what he has been writing. So one would say maybe there were also politics of this kind of academy at the time, that you may not get a scholarship if you are not going to write about this, or you may get a scholarship if you are going to write about this, but this is something that has been going through my mind. And then really come the issue of the representation at the International Court of Justice, where the question of, say, West/Namibia is engaged, and also moving to the issues of the Bushmen, or Khoisan, if you like, to be politically correct today, where it actually even raises questions to date as to how we should study the Bushmen, if we have classified. But then when you look into the disciplinary debate or critique that has been going on, it's that one of singling out certain people to say that these are the type, and these are the type that may perish if they are not well conserved or well taken care of, and if they are not to be kept in a reserve where they can continue to live their own way of life. So I think that is really where this book really begins to open up for those who would want to be anthropologists, or for those who are keen to reading anthropological texts, to say that there is that interface from what anthropology was, or ethnology, or Flottekende, to what it has become. Because now we are writing, engaging with topics. We are writing, critiquing with certain topics. Now, writing anthropology in post-colonial Namibia or independent Namibia is actually also a very different story, because it can also make you an enemy of the state, especially if you are writing in the critical sense on topics that may not seem palatable or taste palatable to those that are hearing. One of them is, for example, when I wrote in one of my papers to say that the post-colonial, or in other words, that when the nation happened, there was no clear ways as to how this nation was going to be built. So you end up creating enemies along the way, because you would be seem to be saying that people do not really have a clear mind and agenda of what it is that they're supposed to do. But when you look at the model of what was happening from 1995 up to the early 2000s, it's exactly the same of the activities that have been performed by Jan Bretty or those or Ulrich Pretorius when was seeing, for example, the Congoro in northeastern Namibia. Moving to winning the hearts and minds, I think for me what came out, and I was telling him also the other time, was the name Pash. This figure is so known by natives, but they didn't even know how to write his name. And when you look at the local government archive, you will not find his print. But he was able to bring it out from outside. And I think for those who are in the archiving sector or industry, really must start to look to it so that some of these things really either declassified if they're still classified, so that students can really begin to look into these things and write about them. And by the way, many people have already died in any case. So not that it's good that people have died, but we have to go at some point. So the other thing is the towering figure of Bourret in say West Africa, and the whole implementation of this plan, this grand plan of really implementing the system that was here and how it has played out over the years. And maybe one should also start to question whether the system was successful because it stayed on for a very long time, and whether there were successes also in the system or not, and what is it that we'll be looking at as we move forward, also looking at some of these critical questions. I think for now I can see so that the other colleagues can also say something. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As I was introduced, my name is Stellenbosch, and I am a historian by training and a teacher by training. I spend most of my time doing research and writing on the history of the Namibian people. And this book is one of the most valuable gifts that I've ever received in my life, based on the experience that I have on the work of writing history since I left the university. That's why perhaps I come in here. So thank you very much, Professor Robert Gordon, for coming up with this book, or for writing this book. For me, it is like you have written it for me, personally, because it resonates so much with what I've done and what I've experienced in my life. The one winning the hearts. Of course, in the late 80s, we were young, the children, about 10 years old. So we attended some of these events that Professor Gordon is writing about. The Zuba event where the village is called to witness magicians, and the military comes to sing in the village and all. We were there as children. It resonates when you read the book. So it also resonates that for us coming from the northeastern part of the country, that is Kavango area, Caprivi, those areas, the question that has always been asked by the people in those regions is, why is it that we don't have a history in this country? We don't have a history. When we go to school, the history textbooks doesn't reflect the history of the people from those areas. It has been asked when we were in university, it has been asked when we left university. It is still being asked today. So far, I mean, that's why when we're in the university, a group of us, including Dr. Rikua here, I see Alois, my brother Alois Kakuru there, and many others. Every time it was part of the discussion that we had. And as for us, the two of us who were attending historical studies, I think we came at the university at the right time, because there were men and women who manned the history department who had the pedigree to change the course. And in our studies, we were being taught that we must make a difference. The history that we have should be changed. And one of the critical topics that were given was the review of, by the late Brigitte Lau, of one of the earliest ethnologists and historians of this country, called Heinrich Wedder, whose work was so much acclaimed by the old regime that it was Alpha and Omega, was the history. But the late Brigitte Lau wrote a very interesting review, scathing review actually, of that work, which revealed the incompetence and actually the shoddy work that Heinrich Wedder did in writing the history of this country. And we took it from there. So when we left the university to go out there and make a difference, to write a history where there is not one. And surprisingly, when we were trying to do that, we came into crossfire of an ethnologist, because an ethnologist who was assigned to that region, to that area, thought that she has done so much, she has written so much, and who are we to come up with a history which is actually challenging that? And letters were written out to actually intimidate us into submission. But surprisingly, probably because we were a new breed, surprisingly we were never cowed down. From there we launched also to respond. And the discourses went on until perhaps it was realized that these people will never stop. So the lawyers had to come in to bring the whole debate to an end. So we said, that debate can end, but the writing of our history will continue. We will not stop. Only death will make us stop to write our history. So this book has come up with a lot of things which really resonate. For example, Professor Gordon talked about the work of ethnologists, in which how they actually concealed, use the word concealing, blocked off and closed off the understanding of the Namibian past. That is exactly we have also picked it up in the reading of this history that were written by the ethnologists. So we have a situation where, of course, you have something written about your people, but that is actually not to contribute to the understanding of the society. And we have been working against this. And we have also come to realize in this book, because we did not know that before the coming out of this book. We knew that there were state ethnologists that were employed by the state to write, that they were actually ethnologists that were working together with the SADF the South African Defence Force. In fact, according to this book written by our professor here, those ethnologists that were employed for each homeland, they were employed by the SADF. They were working for the SADF. Therefore, whatever research or writing that they published during that particular period, 1975 to 1989, that particular period, whatever they wrote, whatever they published, I think somehow must be regarded as a diversionary work or shadow knowledge, because it was not their main job description. Their job description was to advise the SADF and to spy on the people. So the etiquette manuals that were given to the SDF or SWATF or Kufut, advising them how to deal with the black people or the suspect, the terrorist, is of very particular interest to me. If more of these are to be discovered, I think we'll be able to understand in detail the work of ethnologists. Because, for example, growing up in Kavango, we knew that an Oshuambo person, for example, Oshuambo man, in order for him to confess to his crimes or to his terrorist activities, you must cut off his head first. So this kind of views, I think, were promoted. I suspect, were promoted by ethnologists in a way to divide the people, in a way to encourage violence in the Namibian society. So, but for now, we don't have conclusive evidence for that. Only that time when all these etiquette manuals will be found. I read that you only found five. I think most of them maybe have been banned or have been thrown away or whatever. We have to search for these etiquette manuals. Surprisingly, also, the oral materials for the history of whatever that the ethnologists wrote for the people of the homelands, they are not found even in the National Archives today. I see my brother, Mr. Werner Hillebrecht here, can testify. Those oral materials are not at the National Archives. So we ask ourselves, if they were working for the state, they should be there, because the state was paying them. And in terms of state succession law, these properties that were owned by the previous state must be transferred to the new state, which is the state that we have today. And those materials are not there. And this is one of the questions that we must ask. Perhaps, where are the materials that these ethnologists collected during that particular time? So, are they classified? Are they burned down, or are they kept in private archives? So we should work to find all this, because it is only then we will be able to tell that what they wrote is actually scientific. Otherwise, without those materials, whatever they wrote should be regarded as diversionary work and shadow knowledge. Yeah, I have a lot to say, because I said this book. I feel like it was written for me because it resonates so well. So I think for now, I would like to thank you, Professor Robert Gordon. I met you before. You are part of the poison that I become.
Yeah.
When I was about 20 years old, or 21, Professor Robert Gordon came from America, I think, to come and teach at UNA for a month. So I wrote in a conference, I read somewhere, knowledge is power, but power defines what knowledge is. I stole it from one of the chapter that you wrote. So I think, thinking about it, you are actually one of the people that influenced the outlook that I took on this kind of thing. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this book launch. I like speaking by preparation, reading my work, but my colleagues, every time I sit with them, they speak so openly from their own heart that I'm tempted to speak without anything. And then I move out of topic, which I don't want to do. So I'll stick to what I've prepared. But there is that thin line between anthropologists and historians, especially in terms of whether they are the same or different. And there has always been this criticism, sort of like a funny way of making fun of the anthropologists. One statement that I came across is that anthropologists need to decide either to be historians or to be nothing. Right. So there is always that thin line between historians and anthropologists. That's where we always find ourselves in the same space. When I was at the UWC, I think the same time with Mike Akupa here, I remember at the time they did not have a lecturer in the anthropology department. So I was asked, I think, was it Diana Gibson or someone, that maybe you should teach this module. Peopling of Africa was the name of the module. Peopling of Africa. So I took it up, started teaching. I was in the history department doing my PhD, but I took up to teach this module in anthropology. And I thought it was the best thing to do, and it was really, but then I made a mistake to inform my supervisor in the history department that I have been hired by the anthropology department to help teach. Instead of being praised, I was seriously, cautioned that, okay, it's okay to hang around with Michael, but don't be pushed so much, because you are a historian. You should not be pushed so much to go the anthropology way. So, yeah, so there is always that thin line. And I think when I wrote my PhD, finally, it was on contract labor system in Namibia, Voices from the Kavango, the study of contract labor system in Namibia, looking at 1925 until 1972. One of the interesting books that I read as part of the literature review certainly was by Professor Gordon, Migrants and
Masters.
And Masters. That was the name of the book. It's about contract laborers also. But as he explained in his book, that for him, what was the interest there was to try to understand why did these contract laborers decide to leave contract and to go back home. Right? What were the reasons for them to decide to leave the contract work and go back home? And that was interesting reasons that he wrote. So that also gave me an interest to really look now at maybe why did they go there, right? So he was interested on why did they leave, right? But I came to get an example of why did they go. So thank you very much, Prof. Gordon, for being at the forefront of not only anthropology, but the thin line between anthropology and history. So we always have a lot to learn as historians. So I'm very thankful, first of all, that I'm also a reviewer of this book. And I'm very thankful to UNAM Press that we have been given this opportunity to be reviewers. And so this book by Gordon, when I read it, the central role of ethnologists in introducing apartheid to Namibia. And as I read the whole narratives or the whole writing, I think Gordon brings to light the complex relationship that existed, especially between the colonial government and their so-called knowledge experts, academic institutions, in crafting these political ideologies, especially that was useful in the controlling and subjugating of the colonial subject. And Gordon, for example, indicates how the colonial fear of foreign scholars, he speaks about the fear of the foreign scholars, especially in carrying out research among Africans. How this, for example, led to the control of the data collection amongst the community. And I thought this speaks out so much about, this speaks volume to the plight that many academics faced during the colonial period, especially in terms of accessing information for publication. Now, the written outputs of most of these ethnologists that Gordon speaks about or writes about, and as it has been rightly said by the other colleagues, most of these writings that they collected during the colonial period, well, it actually, they exist, and it meant actually that after Namibia's independence, the history, the cultural writing of Namibia has mainly been dominated by these contested research outputs of these ethnologists. And it actually now allows for an urgent need, I thought, of going the way, thinking of decolonizing the educational curriculum, maybe both at school level and also at tertiary levels. And I think it links up to what Mr. Shiremo has said on the whole question of where is our history? What is written about our histories? It's not that it's not there in schools or even at the universities, but maybe it also speaks to what people want to see in the history books. And it speaks about the whole question of decolonizing. Subsequently, this also then raises the question, and I thought, and I kept thinking about it, as to what should actually, if we have to think about decolonization of the education curriculum, what should encompass the role of the Namibian government or the state, academics and academic institutions, especially towards this whole project of decolonizing the curriculum. We know now that during the colonial periods, academic institutions were at the forefront of shaping the educational systems, or not for the sake of maybe controlling or colonizing the minds of our people. But what should be the role of academic institutions, the state, in terms of after independence, in terms of decolonizing the curriculum, working towards decolonizing the minds of most of our people? And Gordon's discussion centrally looks at, for example, how ethnologists' efforts, he looks, for example, at how the Bushman myth was represented, the marginalization, I think, that he speaks about in his book. And I thought that the discussion by Gordon about the marginalization of the Bushmen, or the proper word that you spoke of, the Khoisan, right? I think it speaks to colonial failed projects, especially in terms of developmental, the colonial field projects on community development, especially on the Sun. We have seen, for example, the attempts to develop, I think in Western Caprivi, we have the case of, what is this community? The Barapenas in, yeah. So if you look, for example, at the situation of the communities, the Sun, in that area, it leaves so much to be desired. So it shows an example of failed South African attempts towards maybe developing the San-speaking communities. And it also brings us now to, I think that failed project, for example, it has left so much for the Namibian state to think about. I think after independence, our Namibian is taking off from where the colonial government left in terms of developmental projects for these marginalized communities. And and I've just been thinking that maybe what can post-colonial Namibia learn from the failed apartheid South African attempts or efforts to deal with some development issues, and what should be the role of academics, institutions, we are the academics in these developmental agendas. We have the issue of, I think, not only in Kavango East, but also now in the Etosha area, there's been so much ongoing, especially the struggle of the San on the whole question of marginalization. So it leaves, so that colonial failed project on the San still bears so much on after independence. There's so much left inherited from the colonial government by the Namibian government, especially in terms of what should they do to deal with the San plight, developmental issues. So Gordon highlights the extreme forms also of colonial violence, I think, in his book. When you read his books very well, especially looking at the win-heart mind concept that I think Dr. Cooper spoke about, where they were trying to win the hearts, especially the heart and minds of the young people. I think there's so much impact of Zula, and Shiremo had spoken about how almost everyone, one way or another, got affected. For us as young people, when all these things happened, we were very small, as he said. For some of us, we thought it was fun. We were seeking for fun. Right? So you will see the soldiers coming, playing their drums, and for us it was fun. You will run around following them, and they are playing their drums. They have a lot of food to eat. We'll go and eat food, we'll get the t-shirt. And when you see the swap or the Nantos, for example, yeah, also coming up with their march, right? Marching through towns or wherever in the village, all of us as young people will be following them. Not because we wanted to be serious SWAPO activists or NANSO members, but because we were young people looking for fun. Right? So, and we'll be following all these events. So one way or another, we have followed these events, and it's good. Prof. Gordon, you show that for the colonialists, this was not just a normal way of having fun with the community. It was actually a form of winning hearts and minds. Somehow it was a soft violence. It was a violence on the community in a very soft way, winning hearts and minds. And I think in the same book, Gordon shows the opposite of this soft violence, winning heart and mind, to the physical violence, especially that was meted out on the community previously before the win heart and mind by the colonial officials like the commissioners. We know, for example, that in former Gamboland and Kavango, for example, we have heard of commissioners such as Shongola, maybe you've heard of it, the whip, and you have heard of some of the public floggings by Commissioner Shongola in the 1920s. Kokehan, yeah? Yes, he was called, yes. So, doing public flogging of community members, yeah? Naked in public, right? And I think there are also some violence even by Harold Eads and some of his workers. But it's interesting that all this violence by commissioners, they hardly report about them. They didn't report on their own violence. We don't find it in the archive to say, okay, I'm Shongola here and I'm reporting how I meted out violence on this community. We don't find that. We only find the good part. What is this violence? Is the archive hiding something, Mr. Werner, that we don't know? The violence of the commissioners. So it's very interesting that Professor Gordon brings this out. And Prof. Gordon builds on, I think he mentioned Maurice Sapon, whom we don't know so much, but was a very great scholar who, that he learned something from. He uses the insights to analyze the thinking around these ethnology studies, in which he concludes, Gordon concludes that maybe it was never intended to be the true objective examination of the local culture, but rather to serve the ulterior motive of discovering the local cultural secrets, and which actually, as he says, make the whole exercise futile and very foolish. And Gordon places these ethnology scholars through the lens of Apartheid, a group closed thinking system, and casting doubts on this false information of these scandal mongers, as he calls them. He has a hope to push them to realize that others could rethink the same issues differently. And this is very, very important. That comes out from the book. So overall, I think the book, it has strong points, very useful information, and it will be useful to both historians and anthropologists, especially those who have an interest understanding the role of these ethnologists in the making of Namibia's colonial past. So we are very much thankful. I don't want to put too much salt to well-cooked food, so I think I'll let you. Thank you.
I would like to say, empires actually always had embedded anthropologists. The Romans actually had them. They needed them. See, there was actually no way of having a divided rule system without embedded anthropologists. But the thing is, the embedded anthropologists were actually not the strategists. There were actually also military strategists. And we actually are at the beginning of understanding, see, what kind, you see, of strategies actually happened. Now, I looked up, you see, Patrick O'Malley in the Mandela kind of thing. He actually talked about the Caprivi. In the Caprivi, there were so-called death camps. And the people who were there were the Inkatha, Gachapotolesis people. And they were trained there. And as a matter of fact, I mean, the Gachapotolesis people then, later on, of course, what you see in Peter Marder's book and places like that, you see into fights with the ANC. And you probably know, you see, that the situation, you see, that Mandela found himself in 1994 was actually very dire, because there was a real civil war going on. And Gachapotolesis was actually practically supported. And of course, there were strategists, you see, and some of them, you see, were actually, of course, you see, Americans and whoever, you see, I mean, Cervella actually started to write a few things about that. You can actually look up, you see, the essays that actually have. He, however, you see, is actually not very well liked, you see, in Namibia. Not very much, you see, in South Africa either. But the thing is we actually still have to find out. We need the archives, the confidential archives, see, of all these warring parties that were actually going on. And as I said, of course, Sue Williams actually wrote a book which is called White Malice. And she talks about, you see, what exactly, I mean, the CIA, to sort of, I mean, spread that. I mean, I actually want to actually mention that. See, I personally was a teacher of JMTC. And our hero was actually Nelson Alexander, who actually taught us the decolonizing history, even at that time. If you actually want to, there are 3 essays about the Herreros, which he researched, you see, in Freiburg. And I mean, what he actually did, you see, is just amazing. And second was actually also just an amazing organization, see, in changing, you see, education. Now, unfortunately, of course, you see, the NIP, Ottilie Abrahams and whatever, they were actually dissed immediately in 1990, because you see, they were not in Lusaka. And I mean, that is, I don't know whether they were, they might have actually have been as well, but we actually still have lots of things actually to say. And as I said, you see, the research, you see, into the whole sort of really military strategies that people actually use, that is actually still at the beginning. And I don't want to sort of, I mean, whitewash, you see, the ethnologists, you see. But they were not actually the main names. They were actually the useful idiots.
Thank you. Yeah, just to respond, useful idiots. In fact, let me say, I admire Brevard.
Yes.
I think he's a remarkable person because after he had all these grand ideas, and then he was an activist anthropologist. He became Commissioner General of Humboldt, but he was kicked out after a year. And the reason why he was kicked out, he'd written a memorandum on the plight of the Bushmen. And there were 13 copies, and Pandit Batu, who had from which year, said, if this memorandum goes public, our world court case is sunk. And Brevard had to have this humiliating experience of collecting all 13 copies and giving them to the minister for bad, to burn in his presence. But then what's interesting too, towards the end of his days, he writes this thing to the Broederbond saying, Mense, ons is diep in die apartheid is not going to work, we've got to do something else. And what I admire about Brevard is he had the power to doubt, which Verwoerd never had. And this is the key thing which I hammer in my students. Our basic humanity rests on our ability to doubt what we believe and go beyond that. That makes us human. So that's also, I would say, you know, there are 57 flavors of anthropology, and I'm proud to be an anthropologist. I have no doubt about it. I've become one again. My take is very different to the ethnologists. I argue in my book, quite probably, you know, it's going to cause a bit of a ruckus. I say, look, the strength of anthropology is no one really takes us serious. Truly, I mean, you read these books and people say, oh, I'm a keen amateur anthropologist. You don't get anyone saying, oh, I'm a keen amateur physician or keen amateur economist. But you find frequently, I'm a keen amateur anthropologist. So my argument is basically at the end is that the role for the anthropologist, the one I sort of like, is we've got to become the court jesters in late capitalism and just talk truth to power. And that's why I like this idea of looking at the absurdity of the colonialism. It resonates with my approach on life. I don't take myself seriously. I hope you critique me. I mean, there's nothing nicer than having a good argument and saying you're talking bullshit. But then I'm a farmer, and we all know that bullshit is good fertilizer, so you never know what new ideas are going to come. But yeah, you know, and I'm an activist too, but you know, I think that getting grey, I think that the only thing that we can do as an activist anthropologist nowadays, and I have, yeah, I'll tell you all about my activism days if you're interested, but that will bore you. But our secret to success is we can't really change society, and that's what we should do, is embarrass the rich and the powerful. And that's basically my sort of credo as an anthropologist. There's a saying in America, which I'm surprised isn't Novambu's saying, you've got to stir the pot occasionally to prevent the scum from rising to the top. And that's basically what I think anthropology stir the pot. Any more questions, comments? Yeah, Andre.
Well, let me stand up. First of all, warm congratulations. I haven't read the book, but I've read, as you know, a lot of your work, and I've been greatly stimulated and enlightened by a lot of the work that you've done. But I think there's an interesting dimension in Namibia, which is really not researched to the best of my knowledge. And that is the link between anthropologists and the old South African police. And what is fascinating, if you look at not only what the police did, particularly the so-called security police people, but the sources they draw on. I have, for example, a collection of the Namibian security police. And they comprise, and you're welcome to see it, they comprise a great many works from anthropologists. So that is interesting. That's extraordinarily interesting. And, you know, some of the titles are quite deviant, you know, the sexual behavior of the Negro and things like that. And that, I think, is also interesting, fits into this bigger picture, as you say. Quite absurd, actually, but you're welcome, actually. I've got the whole collection. I got it from one of the very senior security police people who's now farming in the south of the country, I hope blissfully. But you're welcome. And it's an interesting dimension. As far as I know, people haven't actually done any research on that topic. And I think clearly it does link overall to this theme that you are exploring in this book of yours. It's just a comment. It's not.
I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
John.
Yeah, I'll also stand up. Rob, fabulous book and a really interesting discussion. I had a comment for Dr. Lekua, I think coming from something you were saying about failed colonial projects. And I think we can all say 30 years afterwards that the Big Hearts and Minds project happily failed. Although one does wonder to what extent that tinkering with the social dynamics of people in that part of the country might have had lasting effects. I don't think it's easy to tease them out. But when we speak of needing to write our own history as people from that area, the dominance of these colonial contributions is ensured by the fact that they are, for the most part, the only thing on the table. And they will remain dominant, even things that exist only in archival form, in unpublished form, have a huge dominance. They cast this very long shadow over Namibian scholarship, and there's an enormous amount of work to be done there. I also think that there is another species of camouflaged ethnologist on the prowl in Namibia. I'm very interested in the thinking behind community conservation, the way that community relations with nature, the way that rural communities are characterized through, what do we call it, CB&RM? I have a feeling that has a very close kinship with that type of ethnology we thought we had buried. It's come back in that form, and our government promotes it. You'll see the way that rural communities' traditions are promoted as tourist attractions. It's the same thing. Not in camouflage, but in khaki this time. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that front. Thank you.
In this element of disobedience among anthropologists working for the state. So were really all of them delivering blindly what the state wanted to see, or there were like a hidden and perhaps conspiracies among some of them? I mean, were some of them critical about all what the state was wanting to do, and how big was this? And how did the state deal with them? So did they just kick out, or were just pressuring them, or blackmailing them?
There were some very interesting debates going on. Again, I must say, I've come across some moral issues, and in fact, some of the government ethnologists will critique the government. The most famous case, Kula Buddha, who, when he came here, there was the Martin Ashikoto case in the Bambu, where a habitual thief had his eyes put out, and the Department of Bantu Administration wanted him out. And Buddha came up as an expert witness for Ashikoto. And basically, Bantu Administration said you can never go up to beyond the police zone, They wanted to fire in the chief ethnologist in Pretoria, Van Warmelo, had to fly up and plead, no, please keep the sky. I've also seen he critiqued the Windel Commission reports making the Nama colours. We can talk about why they did that, but he was very heavy in his, but it was muted. And he's got great diplomatic skills, and he manages to play around like that. But there were people, and then in Omega camp too, there was an anthropologist, a military anthropologist, who objected to what was going on, but overridden by the senior officials who didn't really take anthropologists seriously. You read the military response to these military people, these ethnologists, and it's ridiculous. They had no time for them, but they were staff officers. In fact, in one of my articles, I made the argument that the ethnography which they were doing, ethnology, which was sort of rote listing of things, was worth more to SWAPO than it was to the SADF because it was so confusing and just plain wrong. You should read the etiquette manuals. It's wonderful literature if you want to see how not to write an etiquette manual. It's all the others so different. And above all, you've got to avoid black women because they do all sorts of things, and you can sort of tie that into the Immorality Act and all sorts of interesting things. But they were very much part of that parcel. And it sort of goes back to the nature of higher education in this country too, where you have rote learning at the Afrikaans universities at that stage, which you didn't question the professor. And the whole thing about this book is it's not so much about anthropologists, it's about experts. What makes an expert an expert? What credentials do they have? And what is expertise? Is it simply a performance act where you impress people with credibility? How do you get credibility? So it tries to go beyond the narrow and sort of go to the universal issues of doubt. What makes an expert an expert? Especially a social scientist or someone who claims to be a social scientist, because that scientist, you're like political scientists. What a stupid label for what they do. It's absurd. How scientific can you be in politics? Yes, sorry, there's a question from someone on Zoom.
Yeah, so the question is to all the panelists, and it's from Jack Anderson. His question is, what was and is the place and space of the Namibian Scientific Society in having crafted or crafting colonial and apartheid ethnographies? The cover of the book does provide suggestions on that. That's from that.
I think he has also written about this place where we are today. I think because we paid, we're not going to kick us out. So, thanks that for the question. But I can only say that certainly the scholarship which was being produced from here was also skewed to a certain side, and I think Rob provides some insights to the effect in his book. But besides that, I also wanted to just briefly comment, taking from my brother there, I didn't get his name, John. Yes, when you say that all this data is still there, and it's going to be there for a long time. And then I would like to start by saying that when the natives begin to speak back, yes, how much time is this native going to need, and how much resources is he or she going to need so that they can begin to speak back? And I think probably this is where this native is speaking back. At least you had that opportunity to engage with this archive, and I was almost going to ask that, how do you do it? Like, how do you get this information, or how do you get these links so that you get access to this kind of data, which is very good. Because I can also say the same thing, that by the time many of these things were written, Kapungu has already written about some of the many important things. For example, in the Kawamo, and one could sense that this led to the trouble in the Catholic Church at the time when he was writing. But he was not being used by the administration of the time. Remember, of course, he's also one of the people who already got a PhD in the country, black for that matter. So it's really the issue of power relations and who is keeping the gate. But there's also a level of denialism when it comes to archives. Once you have a piece of archival evidence, you don't really quite show that you have that information, because like on the issue of winning the hearts and minds, there are a lot of key people, for example, now in the current administration, who were administrators of this process. And when we're asking them about this question, they denied completely that they did not know about this thing. While you have a picture of let's say, the newspaper that was being produced at the time, the picture is there, either the person was a vice chairperson or was a secretary of Zuma and so on. So there's also this level of denialism of wanting to appear to have been this very serious person during that moment, which was very difficult. So I think it's also a challenge we have to really deal with. But on the issue of the success of winning hearts and minds, up to the extent it has gone, I think we can just enjoy it, where we're saying that the government started to use some of these methods. I got in trouble for writing against living museums in Namibia. When you get that sense of a person being objectified to appear as not having changed or developed to a certain extent. I don't care how you define development, but that is one thing which is there. And this has created high levels of tribal belonging before being a Namibian. So, Prof. Dupisani has got us this political one already at UNAM to say that there was a time when Namibians were more Christians than Namibians first. And now they have become more of their tribal or ethnic orientation or belonging than when they are Namibian. So we have, and this is a project of the time which is still continuing. And I think it only gets replicated in various creative ways so that it doesn't appear to be what it is. So I think the community-based movements is just the same concept, where the narrative is of protecting so that it doesn't disappear. But we are moving forward. Investments are coming in at the expense of what people think locally and so on. So what do you really do? So I think it's a dilemma we have, and as social scientists or anthropologists, we really have to start asking these very serious questions as we write. And I think it's also high time that we need to start advocating for more scholarship support for those that are in this field. Because when you look at the model of scholarship support in Namibia, it's very skewed to what I call hard sciences. Yet we have got serious problems, social problems which the government cannot deal with. So how do you have, how many, in the paper recently it was, how many social workers for X number, hundreds of people in the country? So it doesn't quite make sense at all. So that's why I think we as scholars, or we as people who are really in this field, we need to start advocating for this.
Raised by our brother there, John Kina. It's very important that, of course, the archives is colonially dominated. The documents, the materials that we have there is that which was left there by the colonists. And now how do we write a different history from that? Because that continues to dominate, to influence upon our studies. I think that is where critical theory comes in. For example, before history was written as a men's thing, men were the dominant characters in the history. But theories came up, feminism, for example, using the same material that the men were using. With critical theory of feminism, you come up with a different history where women also features it. That is the same. Like, I think I have written somewhere that this book adds to our critical theory of understanding our history. Because the same materials, colonial history that we have. For example, my colleague here have cited Harold Eads, Kakale, Onkare, and Kokihan were very violent by their nature. In actual fact, all the interviews that we have had with the eyewitnesses, we had the opportunity, at least by the time we started interviewing, to have some eyewitnesses, people that were there. And all of them testified to the violence and the abusive nature. That, in what they wrote, in the reports that they wrote to their superior Bantu, you will not see a single incident where they report on their own violence. But now, we can write a true picture of what they really stood for. Because now, we have listened to the other side. That's why there have been some projects with the National Archives over the past few years. I think our brother Bena here can testify, where they promoted oral research and funded people to go out there and bring information, oral research, so that we also deposit it in the National Archives, so as to serve as a counter voice to the dominant colonial narrative. So I think that question is very, very important, and that is one of the ways that we should deal with it. And on the scientific society, I think our professor will say a lot about it. He has, of course, written about it already in his book. But we have seen that there are articles, journal articles that were published in the scientific journal, not only before independence, but even after independence, without the input or the eye of some other experts. Because that time will come when we will look at and we will review these journal articles. From our point of view, they are poorly written and they are not, they do not represent the true picture of what really happened. I've written a paper, a chapter in the book Reviewing Resistance, in the book called Reviewing Resistance in Namibian History. That chapter is called the Girikushara Massacre Revisited. The main purpose why I wrote that is actually to say that there's another story, apart from that one which is written there. So I think that is all that I can say about the scientific society.
Yeah, I think the question from John Kinahan has been well answered by my colleagues. Maybe just to add a little bit on the whole question of that's all we have available. It's true that we have from the colonial past, but as my colleagues have already mentioned, maybe now we can start thinking of how to study the colonial archives. I think there's been a lot of discussions, even academically, on how do we study, how do we use the colonial archives. We know, for example, from some of the readings on studying the colonial archive that we now come to understand that the colonial archive mainly stood, it's actually, even when they speak about the subjects, they speak about the view of the state about the subject. It does not represent the people themselves. It's the position of the state about what they thought about the colonial subject. So we need to critically read, is it along or against the grain? I think that's one of those words that they have been using, studying along or against the grain. Well, we need to really look at what the possibility of the other side using the same materials. Maybe that is definitely one way. So, and continuity in terms of what was there before independence and after independence, especially when you look at some of those developmental projects. It's true, I think it has also been equally mentioned by the colleagues that there seems to be some continuity in terms of what was happening during the colonial period, even in terms of community projects, to what is happening now. But I think for the government, maybe, and for all of us, what is important is that we should now look back critically and see what can we learn from the past experiences of this project. And if we are doing the same projects, what shall we do different? So I think maybe that is the approach to go about it. Thank you, sir.
Ugandas and their feather stars. Now the thing is that if feather star was actually as horrible as is been said, and of course Brigitte now exposed, she specifically, referred to the thing, he said, you see, Africans are tribes, and tribalists, you see, actually always inside the tribe, you see, they actually have, you see, a fight for ranking, top ranking, and then there's inside a bit of a stability, but outside, everybody actually kills everybody. So that actually was one of the things that he actually said. Now the one thing is, one you can actually say, in addition to that, Feder knew Herero and quite a few other African languages, and he actually knew the stories. Now, as a matter of fact, you can actually, in Augustinium, you see, he was actually a guy that people who actually then founded the Oruano, and Zacchaeus Thomas, you see, in Tietmans, who actually founded the AME Church, they liked Feder because, you see, they knew that he knew a lot. So you actually have to take Feder's things and get, you see, the people's voices out of it. Because, you see, in what he writes, you see, there are also the people's voices in it. Theo Sondermeier was actually much better than that, you see, but Feder is actually a funny kind of character.
Thank you very much for coming.